Nadie sabía exactamente cuándo empezó todo, pero todos en el barrio habían visto alguna vez a Lucía en el jardín. Siempre al atardecer, siempre entre las flores, y siempre llorando. No era un llanto escandaloso, ni desesperado. Era silencioso, contenido, como si incluso su tristeza tuviera miedo de hacer ruido. Desde la ventana de la casa de enfrente, Mateo la había observado muchas veces. Al principio, pensó que era coincidencia. Pero con los días, entendió que no lo era. Algo no estaba bien. Lucía vivía con su familia en una casa impecable por fuera. Paredes recién pintadas, cortinas elegantes, un jardín lleno de rosas que ella misma cuidaba con dedicación. Todo parecía perfecto, excepto ella. Su mirada siempre evitaba a los demás, sus pasos eran ligeros, casi invisibles, y su sonrisa rara vez aparecía. Mateo no era alguien que se metiera en la vida de otros. Pero había algo en esa escena repetida, una mujer llorando entre flores que ella misma cultivaba, que no podía ignorar. Una tarde, decidió acercarse. No planeó mucho lo que diría. Solo caminó hacia el jardín cuando la vio otra vez, arrodillada junto a las rosas, con lágrimas cayendo sobre los pétalos. «Las estás regando demasiado», dijo suavemente. Lucía se sobresaltó. Rápidamente se secó las lágrimas y evitó mirarlo. No, solo estaba cuidándolas. Mateo no insistió, pero se quedó ahí unos segundos. Lo suficiente para notar algo más. Sus manos temblaban, y había una marca tenue en su muñeca. No dijo nada. Solo asintió y se fue. Esa noche, no pudo dejar de pensar en ella. Con el paso de los días, empezó a notar pequeños detalles. Voces elevadas dentro de la casa. Puertas que se cerraban con fuerza. Una vez incluso escuchó una risa cruel que no encajaba con la imagen de familia perfecta. Todo comenzó a tomar forma en su mente, aunque aún no tenía pruebas. Una tarde lluviosa, la vio de nuevo. Pero esta vez no estaba en el jardín. Estaba en la entrada de la casa, de pie, completamente inmóvil mientras una mujer mayor, su madre, supuso Mateo, le hablaba con desprecio. «No sirves para nada. Ni siquiera sabes comportarte como una hija decente». Lucía bajó la cabeza. No respondió. Mateo sintió un nudo en el estómago. Esa noche entendió algo. Lucía no lloraba por debilidad. Lloraba porque no tenía donde más hacerlo. Y por primera vez, decidió que no iba a quedarse mirando. Antes de continuar, si esta historia ya te está tocando el corazón, asegúrate de suscribirte al canal. Historias como esta no solo se cuentan, se sienten. Y lo mejor aún está por venir. Mateo no sabía exactamente cómo ayudar, pero sabía que debía hacerlo. No podía seguir ignorando lo evidente. Al día siguiente, volvió al jardín, y esta vez llevó algo consigo. Una pequeña maceta con una flor distinta, una que no había visto en ese lugar. Lucía estaba ahí, como siempre. «Esta no necesita mucho sol», dijo él, colocándola cerca de ella. «Pero igual florece». Lucía lo miró por primera vez directamente. Sus ojos estaban cansados, pero curiosos. «¿Por qué me la das?» «Porque creo que tú también eres así». El silencio que siguió no fue incómodo. Fue distinto. Fue humano. Ese fue el inicio. Con el tiempo, Lucía empezó a hablar. Poco a poco. Primero sobre las flores. Luego sobre cosas simples. Hasta que un día, sin darse cuenta, habló de su casa. De los comentarios constantes. De las humillaciones disfrazadas de disciplina. De cómo la hacían sentir pequeña incluso cuando no hacía nada malo. «Es como si no importara lo que haga», dijo. «Siempre está mal». Mateo escuchó, sin interrumpir, sin juzgar. Y eso, para Lucía, lo cambió todo. Porque por primera vez, alguien no la hacía sentir invisible. Las cosas no cambiaron de inmediato en su casa. Las voces seguían. Las críticas también. Pero algo dentro de Lucía empezó a transformarse. Ya no se quedaba en silencio absoluto. Ya no lloraba todas las tardes. A veces, solo se sentaba entre las flores, y respiraba. Un día, después de una discusión especialmente dura, salió al jardín como siempre. Pero esta vez, No lloró. Hoy no, susurró. Mateo la vio desde la distancia. Y sonrió. Porque entendió algo importante. Él no la había salvado. Solo le había recordado que ella podía salvarse a sí misma. Semanas después, Lucía tomó una decisión. No fue impulsiva. Fue firme. Buscó ayuda. Habló con alguien fuera de su entorno. Y poco a poco, empezó a reconstruir su vida lejos de ese ambiente que la hacía sentir menos. El jardín siguió ahí. Las flores también. Pero ya no eran testigos de su dolor, sino de su renacimiento. Y Mateo dejó de ser solo un observador. Se convirtió en alguien que estuvo presente cuando más importaba. Porque a veces, lo más poderoso que puedes hacer por alguien es simplemente verlo. Y si esta historia te dejó pensando, sintiendo o recordando algo importante, suscríbete al canal. Porque hay muchas historias más esperando ser contadas.
Y quien sabe. Tal vez la próxima si la que alguien necesita escuchar hoy. The sun was sinking slowly behind the hills, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and violet, the kind of evening that usually brought peace to anyone who looked at it. But that day the beauty of the moment went unnoticed by the only person sitting in the garden, because Lucia was crying, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet, suffocating way that feels heavier than screams. Her shoulders trembling as she sat among the flowers, her fingers clutching petals she didn't even realize she had torn apart. And if someone had passed by they might have thought she was simply admiring the garden, because she had learned long ago how to hide her pain in plain sight, how to make her suffering look like silence, how to exist without being seen. And yet someone did see her that evening, someone who wasn't supposed to notice, someone who had only come to deliver something and leave, but instead stopped, frozen, for a moment at the sight of a girl breaking quietly among blooming flowers, because there is something deeply unsettling about sadness in a place that looks so alive. And that someone was Daniel, a young man who had recently moved into the neighborhood, who had heard rumors about the house behind the garden but had never paid much attention to them, until now, because what he saw in that moment wasn't gossip or exaggeration, it was real, raw pain, the kind that doesn't need words to explain itself, and for a brief second he hesitated, wondering if he should walk away, because after all it wasn't his business. People have their own lives, their own problems, and stepping into someone else's world can sometimes make things worse. But then Lucia tried to wipe her tears quickly, as if even the air wasn't allowed to witness them, and something about that gesture hit him harder than anything else, because it meant she wasn't just sad. She was used to hiding it, and no one should ever get used to hiding pain like that, so without fully thinking it through. He took a step closer, careful not to startle her, but she noticed him anyway, her eyes widening slightly before she looked down again. Embarrassed, as if being seen in pain was something shameful, and Daniel spoke gently, his voice calm. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." And Lucia shook her head quickly, still avoiding eye contact. "It's fine?" she whispered, though nothing about her seemed fine, and there was an awkward silence that followed. The kind that feels like a fragile bridge between two strangers who don't yet know if they're allowed to cross into each other's worlds. And Daniel could have left at that moment. Maybe that would have been the easier choice, but instead he said something simple, something that wasn't meant to fix anything but to acknowledge what was already there. "You don't have to pretend you're okay." And those words, as quiet as they were, landed inside Lucia like a shock, because no one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever given her permission to not be okay, and for a second it felt like her carefully built walls might collapse. But she held them up, forcing a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just tired," she said, and Daniel didn't push further, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is not demand their story, but simply stay. So he sat down a short distance away, not too close, not too far, just enough to show he wasn't leaving, and they stayed like that in silence for a while. The sound of the wind moving through the flowers filling the space between them, until from inside the house a sharp voice cut through the calm. "Lucia, where are you?" And instantly her body tensed, her shoulders stiffening, her eyes filling with fear rather than annoyance. And that reaction told Daniel everything he needed to know without hearing another word. Because fear like that doesn't come from a simple call. It comes from something deeper, something repeated, something learned, and Lucia stood up quickly, brushing her hands against her dress. "I have to go," she said, her voice barely steady, and Daniel nodded, though something inside him didn't feel right about letting her walk back into whatever was waiting for her inside that house. And as she turned to leave, he said, "Hey, if you ever need to talk, I'm around." And she paused for just a second, not turning back, but not walking away immediately either, as if part of her wanted to believe him, but didn't yet know how, and then she left, disappearing behind the door that closed with a quiet but heavy finality. And Daniel stayed in the garden for a moment longer, looking at the flowers, at the place where she had been sitting, at the crushed petals left behind. And he realized that what he had witnessed wasn't just a moment of sadness. It was a pattern, a life, something that had been happening long before he arrived, and something told him it wouldn't stop on its own. And inside the house, Lucia stepped into a completely different world, one where the air felt heavier, colder, where every movement had to be careful, every word measured, because Carmen was already waiting, her arms crossed, her expression sharp with judgment. "Took you long enough?" she said, and Lucia lowered her gaze immediately. "I was just outside," she replied softly. "Of course you were, avoiding your responsibilities again," Carmen snapped, and her father sat at the table, silent as always, pretending to read something, pretending not to hear, because silence had become his way of surviving, even if it meant letting his daughter face everything alone. And that silence hurt Lucia more than the insults, because it meant she wasn't worth defending, and dinner continued in that tense, suffocating atmosphere where every small action could trigger criticism. Every bite of food felt like swallowing stones, and when Lucia accidentally dropped her fork, the sound echoed louder than it should have, and Carmen sighed dramatically. "Can't you do anything right?" And those words, repeated over months, over years, had slowly carved themselves into Lucia's mind, turning into a voice that followed her even when no one else was speaking, telling her she wasn't enough, she wasn't worthy, she wasn't seen. And that night, when she returned to her room, she didn't cry immediately. She just sat there, staring at nothing, feeling everything and nothing at the same time, until eventually the tears came again. Silent, controlled, hidden, just like always. But something had changed, something small but important, because this time, when she closed her eyes, she remembered the voice. In the garden, "You don't have to pretend you're okay." And for the first time, that thought stayed with her, like a tiny spark in the darkness, fragile, but real. And outside, under the same fading sky, Daniel made a quiet decision, one he didn't fully understand yet, but one that would change everything. Because sometimes all it takes to start breaking a cycle of pain is one person who chooses not to look away. The next morning arrived like any other, the same house, the same walls, the same tension lingering in the air like something invisible but suffocating. But inside Lucia something was no longer the same. Because once someone sees you, truly sees you, it becomes harder to keep believing that you are invisible. And as she stood in front of the mirror, she noticed it. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden burst of confidence, but a subtle shift in her eyes, a quiet awareness that maybe, just maybe, the voice in her head that told her she was nothing wasn't entirely true. And that thought alone was enough to make everything feel slightly different. Even the way she walked into the kitchen, even the way she sat down at the table, and Carmen noticed it immediately, because people who control others are often the first to sense even the smallest change. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked sharply, and Lucia blinked, realizing she hadn't lowered her gaze fast enough. "I'm not," she replied, her voice calm but not as fragile as before, and that small difference was enough to shift the atmosphere, because change doesn't always arrive loudly, sometimes it whispers, but even a whisper can disrupt a pattern. And throughout the day, Lucia found herself thinking about the garden, about Daniel, about the simple sentence that had stayed with her, and later, when she returned outside, she half expected him not to be there, because people don't usually stay, people notice and then they leave. But he was there, leaning against the fence, as if he had been waiting, without making it obvious. And when he saw her, he didn't ask questions, didn't push, he simply said, "You came back." And she nodded, sitting down again among the flowers, and this time the silence between them felt different, less heavy, less guarded, until eventually she spoke. Not everything, not the whole story, but enough, small pieces of truth that had been trapped inside her for too long. And Daniel listened, really listened, without interrupting, without judging, without trying to fix her. And sometimes that kind of listening is more powerful than any advice, because it gives space for someone to hear their own voice again, and day by day, conversation by conversation, something inside Lucia began to rebuild. Not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily, like a flower growing through cracks in stone. And with that growth came something new, something unfamiliar but strong, the ability to question what she had always accepted, the ability to see that what was happening in her home wasn't normal, wasn't deserved, wasn't something she had to carry forever. And the turning point came one evening, when Carmen began again, the same tone, the same sharp words, the same attempt to reduce Lucia to something small. "You're nothing without this family," she said, and normally those words would have sunk deep, reinforcing everything Lucia had been made to believe. But this time something resisted, something refused to accept it, and before she could stop herself, before fear could silence her again, Lucia spoke. "That's not true." And the room went completely still, because it was the first time she had ever contradicted Carmen. The first time she had stepped outside the role that had been forced on her, and Carmen's expression hardened. "What did you say?" And Lucia's heart was racing, her hands trembling, but her voice didn't disappear. "I said that's not true," she repeated, and in that moment she wasn't just speaking to Carmen. She was speaking to every version of herself that had stayed silent, every moment she had swallowed her pain, every tear she had hidden, and something powerful happened. Not because the situation suddenly became easy, but because she realized she could speak. She could exist beyond the limits that had been placed on her. And her father finally looked up, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time in years, and Mateo watched with a mix of fear and admiration. Because courage like that doesn't go unnoticed. And the argument that followed wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean or resolved in a single moment, but it was real, it was a break in the pattern. A crack in something that had seemed unbreakable, and that night, when Lucia returned to the garden, she didn't cry. She breathed, deeply, freely, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, relief, and Daniel was there again. And when she told him what had happened, he smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because she had taken the hardest step, the first one, and as the wind moved through the flowers, Lucia looked around and realized something profound. She had always come here to hide. But now she was here because she wanted to be, because this place no longer represented her pain, it represented her growth, and for the first time, she didn't feel like the broken petals in her hands, she felt like the flower that kept standing despite everything, and as time passed, things at home didn't magically become perfect. But they changed, boundaries were set, silence was broken, and most importantly, Lucia no longer saw herself through the lens of someone else's cruelty. She saw herself clearly, and that changed everything. Because when you stop believing the lies that were used to control you, you take back power that was never meant to be lost. And the story that began with quiet tears in a garden didn't end with sadness. It ended with strength, with voice, with a life that was no longer defined by humiliation but by resilience. And as the final scene fades, Lucia stands among the flowers once more. Not crying, not hiding, but standing tall. Her eyes reflecting something new, something undeniable: freedom.